Thank you for having me here. We're excited about our program in Minnesota. I hope I can do it justice. There are activity packets at every single table. And if a table doesn't have these activity packets, you've got to let me know. I only have one other copy. So you should have what I will be referring to as a poster. It's the 14 by 8 piece of paper. You should have a little packet of tiny cutout rectangles that I'm going to refer to as the rungs of the ladder. You will have a handout with definitions on it. So there should be definitions, and there are some 2 Minnesota legislative statutes that might be of interest. There is the flow chart of the Minnesota permitting process, where we are required to pull in cumulative impacts. And there are hypothetical regulatory scenarios that I have given every single table. Does every table have this packet of information? No? Okay. It would also be great if the tables kind of had a mix of agency folks and community folks. So if that isn't the case, feel free to get up and move. And with that, that's the setup. And now we're just going to get started. So I'll introduce myself a little bit with this word cloud. We learn from people we trust. And you guys don't know me from Adam, and so these are some things about me. The mother of a 15-year-old who just started driver's ed. We do road trips for vacations. I'm an extremely slow marathon runner. I'm not that appreciative of our Minnesota winters, but I get through them and get outside as much as we can. Anyway, so I'm also addicted to puzzle rooms. So those are some things about me, not that I'm narcissistic, but I think that's important that you know who I am so that you're interested and can trust me enough to provide information and gain that information from me. And I always do this now because the very first community meeting I ever did, I didn't introduce myself. And the third question was, who are you? And I thought, oh. Yeah, I mean, I just got right down to business and was talking about my program and what we wanted to do and so forth. So from then on, I've tried to make a slide so I remind myself to introduce myself properly. Today, we're going to go through this poster that is on people's tables. And this is we got together as an agency to talk about and to work on environmental justice. And one of the 5 work groups was cumulative impacts. And our division director heard us all saying things and put together this visual of the components in an environmental impact analysis. And so the blue rectangles on your left are the components of a cumulative impact analysis. And then these arrows that are on the right side kind of are a variation of each of these components. So each of these components have data, either more or less data available. Each of these components might be more qualitative, words, maps, text, or they could be quantitative, numbers, statistics, etc. And in our agency, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, we have a varying ability to require these components within analyses. So this is kind of our framework of thinking about all of this. So I'm going to refer to these rectangles, the blue rectangles, as the rungs of the ladder. And I'm going to talk through each of these components. And the way that I want you to take notes as a table for each of these components is you have a bunch of Post-it notes at your table. And you're going to write notes and think of more tasks and indices to include on each of the rungs of the ladder. And hold on. This is kind of what we're going for. I just did this exercise with our EJ Stakeholder Advisory Group. And so what you're going to do is go through, I'm going to pause, stop talking, and get you guys to write down on the Post-it notes indices or tasks within each of these rungs of a ladder. So I'm going to start, and we'll see how this goes. The first rung defines sensitivity. Things are cumulative if they protect the whole population. And a lot of ways of doing that is protecting the most sensitive part of a population. Sensitivity is the degree of a response to a stimuli. For example, if everyone in this room was stung by a bee, some of us would have no impact, some of us would have a bump, an itchy bump, some of us would require medication to stay alive. That is a variance in sensitivity. Another thing you can think about with sensitivity is in the state of Minnesota, water quality standards, for example, are developed for the sensitive species and aquatic ecosystem. So different aquatic life has different sensitivities to exposure. So this is sensitivity. I'm going to give you a couple of examples and then make myself pause and let you guys take notes and copy what I have and come up with other ideas for sensitivity. And Holly Wilson will be talking later. These types of things can empower people to make better permit and rule comments. These are things that people can write down and say, was this analysis sensitive, and maybe be more detailed about their comments, and she'll talk about that later. But nonetheless, so sensitivity, you might have health benchmarks that protect asthmatics. They might be the most sensitive population for a certain air pollutant. Elderly are sometimes the most sensitive population. They might have a bigger response to a stimuli. Existing diseases can make people more sensitive to some type of stimuli. We can also adjust health benchmarks that we've talked about. Health benchmarks are a comparison value where you compare an air concentration to a level, some kind of level, and that comparison level is a health benchmark. So we can adjust them for early life exposure. Sometimes the most sensitive population is the population from 0 to 2 years old. So now I'm going to pause for 30 seconds or so to let the tables group and write these down or come up with other indices that could be used in an analysis to report or represent sensitivity. And this will be the first one. It'll get easier. Sorry, I'm going to pop in again and we're going to go on to the next one. This is going to be kind of quick, but as you guys know, this is going to be a continuing conversation in the state of Oregon. This is a jump-off point, so this will allow people to talk about this more later. The next, oh, and I had another little post-it note. Health benchmarks developed for the most sensitive population, which is basically what we've been talking about. The next part of cumulative impacts, in some ways, you can look at a facility pollutant by pollutant. In other ways, you could set up an analysis that looked at the pollutants as a product of additivity. This is the assumption that exposure to each of the single pollutants has an additive effect. That's one way to be cumulative. If you get to look at more than one pollutant at a time, you are using additivity. I'm going to go through my examples again. You can also add pollutants based on a certain health effect relative to one pollutant that you know a lot about, and that's potency equivalence. If you're assessing mixtures, you get credit for having some cumulative components in your analysis. And so now I'm going to pause again for a minute and let you guys take notes and come up with other tasks or related indices that would reflect additivity. So I'm going to give you a minute. Sorry it's so short. Okay, sorry, I'm going to wrench you guys out of your conversations and we'll move to the next rung of the ladder. Are you guys ready? Okay, so the next rung of the ladder are multiple pathways. And these are different ways that people are exposed to pollutants. And if you are able to look at both inhalation and ingestion, for example, at the same time, that is a cumulative component of an analysis. You can also develop health benchmarks, which sometimes happens, assuming that people are exposed to more pathways than one. So that's one way, that's what I have, the development of health benchmarks that has the assumption of other exposures. Drinking, obviously, contact with skin, showering, swimming, inhalation, breathing is a way we're exposed to pollutants. And then I have all the ingestion related exposure, so eating foraging animals, eating fish, and so forth. I'm gonna, give you one more minute. I know it's not enough time, but one more minute to try and discuss other pathways that might be important in Oregon. Okay, again, we're gonna take a pause from the conversations and move on to the next rung of the ladder. The people from Oregon already discussed this, but you can also incorporate into your analysis a look at multiple sources. This is another ability to think cumulatively within an analysis. So multiple sources might be, you get to look at all the emissions of a facility. You don't have to just look at the project or the addition. You get to look at the whole facility at once. You get to look at what's already there, these historical depositions and so forth, or adding in nearby sources. So these are 3 ways that people can address looking at multiple sources. Again, I'm gonna pause and let you guys talk about, in Oregon, what might be some additional sources that aren't already reflected in this slide that are important. Okay, we're gonna take another pause and go to the next rung of the ladder, or the next way or component of a cumulative analysis, and talk through that. Now this one is a very cutting edge and not done. There aren't a lot of data for this one, but this is non-chemical stressors. These are elements in the environment that aren't chemicals, so they might be noise, or, and these are things that our AJ advisory group came up with for Minnesota. Chronic stress. You know, some amount of stress stops you from running across the road in front of a car. Chronic stress brings down your ability to be resilient. So noise, crime we had. I'm gonna pause just for a minute and let you guys come up with some other things, their impacts, that are not chemicals. Okay, we're gonna pause again. I'm gonna give you more time on the next one, I'll just let you know. So, non-chemical stressors, there were a couple other ones that Minnesota came up with, I believe, that are here. Someone said aesthetics, like staring at a stack every day. If that's what you look out at, that can be a non-chemical stressor. Aesthetics are important about where we live. Someone said no green space. That's a big deal. And historic trauma, someone said. Infectious agents, that's a really interesting one. We don't do this very often, or I don't know if we have ever done this, but some infectious agents like cryptosporidium, for example, might have a stomach effect, and an air pollutant, say, might have a stomach effect too, and you're being exposed by 2 different media. One's biological and one's chemical, and that is a really interesting path to go down, I think. But that is a tricky one. These non-chemical stressors are tricky. So the second one I'm going to do now, this is something that this room knows a lot about, is community vulnerability. Vulnerability is obviously a community's resilience. It's your ability to deal with some kind of effect or stressor. The AJ group in Minnesota came up with a bunch of these. I'm going to let the tables just work on their own, and then I will share what Minnesota said. So for example, going back to the getting stung by bees, again, sensitivity is a response to a stimuli, a differing degree of a response to a stimuli. Vulnerability, you know, everyone's saying this room stung by a bee. Vulnerability would be people's access to their EpiPens, people's health care funds that would allow them to buy an EpiPen, people's ability to buy bee protective equipment. If you live in a community that happens to be infested by bees, that addresses vulnerability. So that's the difference there. So I want you guys to talk as tables. I'm going to do the best I can to give you guys more time because this is an important one. And this is even more challenging to address in air permitting than non-chemical stressors. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes. Okay, so we can take a break from that. And I'll go through the list of vulnerability indices that were of interest to the EJ stakeholder group in Minnesota. So what they came up, okay. I can do the elementary school. Put your hands on your head, put your hands on your nose, put your hand on your shoulder. So what the EJ stakeholder group in Minnesota came up with was historic exposures, and you'll notice that was in non-chemical stressors also. Emergency preparedness and management funding, equity in that. Land stewardship, they had that also in non-chemical stressors. Addressing land use was a very big deal. Lack of engaged elected officials, unmaintained housing. There were a ton. That's why I gave you guys more time. Genetic predisposition to disease, language barriers, dense population, more sources, no health care, social determinants of health, and underemployment, structural racism. Okay, sorry. And that was all of them. And so now we're gonna take a pause again of the activities, and I'm gonna go through the reason that I'm here, which it started in about 2008 with a unique statute in Minnesota. And it stemmed out of the community. It was during the time where there was a call for domestic fuel sources. And so there was a proposal that went forward for a biomass burner in Minneapolis. And the biomass burner was going to produce steam and electricity. And there was a huge opposition to this proposal. And out of that came, basically a statewide opposition to this. And out of that stemmed this statute that applies to the area where this biomass burner was proposed. So I'm going to go through that. There is a copy of this statute in your handout on your tables. And this is what we are required to do. This statute was written under the permitting authority of the state of Minnesota under air permitting. It requires us to analyze and consider cumulative levels and effects. So this is our definition. We're going to go to definitions later. Of past and current environmental pollution from all sources on the environment and residents of the geographic area within which facilities emissions are likely to be deposited. So this is the definition given to our agency. We're the pollution control agency, so we're like the DEQ in Oregon, from the legislature. So this was the legislative definition of cumulative levels and effects in our state. It went through a couple of iterations through session. I was not involved in that. I was only involved in the development of it once it was passed. But, at first it was proposed statewide, and there was some opposition to that, so the legislative author rewrote it to directly impact her area, and it happened to be that area around where the biomass burner was proposed. And so she used a series of 5 and clauses that are in your handout to really make this a very specific requirement to an area in South Minneapolis. This is all in the handout that's on the table. This is the area. So you can see on the lower left-hand side where Minnesota is located in the United States, and then you can see the Twin Cities in the box on the right-hand side. About 50% of our population lives in the Twin Cities. And then this is about a 1 square mile, oddly shaped circle that this statute applies to. The reason it's an oddly shaped kind of ellipse is because one of the and clauses was a half-mile buffer around this Superfund site that was in Minneapolis, in this area of Minneapolis. So that is where it is required. Now I'm going to go through what we decided to do based on this requirement. The first thing, we used existing regulatory tools to comply with this. So first what we did is we used a computer model to estimate air concentrations around the facility And these are the kinds of air pollutants that have ambient air quality standards. We refer to them as criteria pollutants. So we did a modeling effort for criteria pollutants. We compared each of these criteria pollutants to it's called a significant impact level. It tends to be 1 to 4% of the standard. And so if pollutants were above that significant impact level, I will tell you later what we did with them, but just remember, right now we're using modeling, computer modeling, to estimate air concentrations and then comparing them to screening levels to get a list of pollutants. The next thing we did was the same thing for air toxics. And air toxics, again, are air pollutants that we assess them. We use comparison values that are health-based values or health benchmarks. And I have noted all of the different ways that these are cumulative. So now we have a list of air toxics. We have a list of criteria pollutants. And what we did was we polled the health endpoints that were aligned with each of these air pollutants. So PM2.5, for example, fine particles have a cardiovascular and a respiratory endpoint. It impacts lungs, it impacts hearts. So what we did is we took those health endpoints as a way to determine what environmental health data or which of those vulnerabilities and non-chemical stressors to pull into the analysis. You can't look at everything all the time. We did not have the resources. So that's one way we scoped this analysis, is we got a list of air pollutants based on these screening levels that we set up, and we aligned them with the health benchmarks, their sensitive health endpoints, and pulled in environmental health data for that. And there's an example here. So for any analysis, we would always pull in the whole facility, all of the facility air concentrations that were modeled compared to either health benchmarks or standards, pull in nearby sources, and we would report socioeconomic status in comparison to the county and the state level, that type of thing. But say it's a respiratory, we get a pollutant in that list that has a respiratory or lung impact. We would pull in nearby traffic, sources, environmental tobacco smoke rates, air quality index rates, asthma, hospitalizations, and emergency room visits, etc. So that's kind of the way we did it. So we pull in all this information. Some of this is qualitative, some of this is quantitative, and it gets pulled into a report. And so it is a way of using existing regulatory tools to provide decision makers with a holistic look at a facility. Okay, I'm not there yet. So I want to say one more thing. In the legislation, there was no cumulative benchmark assigned to that. So we don't have a cumulative risk level. I don't think anyone does. And that was a disappointment and a struggle. But we did have an ability to do an analysis, and we have gotten permitting limits from this analysis, lowering permitting limits from this analysis. Okay? So a big part of this was communicating. I don't mean to be flippant with this slide, but we did a lot of communicating early and often about this, which the state of Oregon is already doing. We've met, as soon as we get a permit application, we met with the community to talk through it. And that is a discomfort to an agency because they haven't reviewed it yet. When you get a permit application, you don't know if the technical information is accurate yet. And that's our job, is to review all that technical information in a permit application. So we would meet and have kind of an office hours type of thing. We call them information sessions. And we had small groups. We would get together, we'd have the air permit, we could talk about how we were going to review it, and we got things out of those meetings. Like, one of the things, we don't have community wisdom. We know about the facility, we know about the air emissions, but for example, in one of the information sessions, a woman said, well, there are elderly living at this high location near that facility. Can you guys model an air concentration at a higher elevation, like 4 stories up? And we said, yes, we can do that, and that's a good idea, and we didn't know about that. So that was a really good interchange, and we've learned things from those meetings. So communication is really important. Now we're meeting even sooner, which every little step is great, and there's always discomfort with every change. But now we're meeting as soon as we hear that there might be a permit, which has also been helpful. And the way we're doing that is if we're invited someplace, we'll go. And, let's see. Oh, I'm not here. I keep going fast. So where we are, we've done 2 air permits through this process, and we're now working on the 3rd air permit. And because it's a cumulative requirement, we are ending up working on the 3rd permit in parallel to the 4th permit. So the 3rd permit required us to look at another nearby facility, which now we're looking at them in tandem, which it makes the process a little longer, but it has required a look where we wouldn't have usually looked at something. So that's Minnesota's unique statute, and that's what we've done. Now we're going to get into the harder exercises for the tables. There are some definitions out there that are relevant nationwide. I'll go through them. The way I learned about definitions in elementary or middle school is I'd have a definition, I'd have to underline keywords. That's what I suggest here, even though we're all adults. Anyway, so EPA has a definition for cumulative risk assessment. Some of you on your handout, it's just a text handout. You will have each one of these definitions on your handout. There will be 1 star by one of these definitions. Pay attention to the definition that you have a star on, okay? So this is cumulative risk assessment from the US EPA. This pulls in aggregate exposures. It pulls in the idea of agents or stressors, and it pulls in the idea of multiple agents and stressors and combined risks. So some of you are going to be analyzing this definition further. This is, again, talk to California. We talked to them. This is a definition that came out of a facilitated and transparent process involving the state of Minnesota and federal groups and academic groups and communities to come up with a definition for cumulative impacts. This definition really pulls in those vulnerability indices that you guys wrote down. And some of you will have a star by the cumulative impacts definition. This is a really holistic definition. The final definition comes out of the National Environmental Policy Act, and some states have their own policy act. Minnesota has their Minnesota Environmental Policy Act. And this definition is something that's done, it's required to be done in environmental review. So something for bigger facilities. So we're going to go on to the second to last table activity. Every table you have 1 definition. Look at that definition, read it, and determine which of the little rectangle pieces of paper or the rungs of the ladder that this definition calls for. So does that definition tell you to pull in sensitivity? Does it tell you to pull in multiple sources? Does it tell you to pull in multiple pathways? So that's the task. I'll give you 5 minutes to do it. Okay, now we're going to get into the final and last table activity. I am so grateful that you guys are willing to do this. It's fun to watch it happen. Anyway, so we're going to move on to the 4th activity. We're going to add a level of complexity to your other activities. You have a regulatory scenario at your table. I want you to pull your regulatory scenario up. It should have a map on it. These are made up situations. And I want you to use your definition and, use your definition. Figure out how you could use the rungs of the ladder that you talked about to do an analysis within this regulatory scenario. Okay, I'm gonna sign off because this is our last piece of information or task before lunch, and I know lunch is ready and back there and it looks good. I again am from Minnesota. This is our cumulative impacts in South Minneapolis permitting website. If you email me, I'll send you that link because that's a very, very long link. My phone number's up there, it's my direct line and my email, and you can call me and ask me questions about this exercise. I hope that it was beneficial, and I'm really, really grateful that you were willing to do this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.